All right, let's finish up this sport finance component, and we'll talk about forecasting. Some of this is going to seem a little bit hairy. Please read the chapter. It's very short. You have some great examples. I'm not going to give you a ton of stuff because, again, we could talk about this for hours, hours upon hours. But when we look at the difference between budgeting and forecasting, there are some major things that just jump right out at you. When we think about budgeting, we think about very clear-cut pathway or outline of how we're going to spend our money. It's very quantifiable. We have a short span. Maybe it's the annual budget for the whole year. Maybe it's a quarterly budget. We are going to prepare these, and we're going to use this based off previous information, and we're going to basically project what that's going to be, and it's going to be what we run with. We may have to do a revision every now and then when we go over or what we get more money than we might have anticipated. But when you compare that with forecasting, you basically gather information and you predict based on what you think you might earn. You forecast how things are going to be in good and bad situations. You forecast for rainy days. You forecast for fluctuations in the market. And basically, the two things seem and appear to be somewhat similar, but you really need both of them because in order to have a good solid budget, you've got to have a good solid forecasting method. And when you start to plan, you're essentially forecasting what's going to happen. When you have the plan, that's going to be your budget, and you really just stick to it. So collegiate budgeting is always a little bit squirrely because you have a budget in July, and that budget is going to be adjusted in October. And for those of you that aren't sure why, or you've never asked why, and maybe your school doesn't have this, but most institutions in October, that's when you get the census of who's actually going to be in class, because students that are on the roster in August are not always the students who are on the roster in October. And so there are refunds, there are people who just never pay and just never show up, but we anticipate they're going to be there, and so that's part of our budget. And so then we make adjustments. For those of you that are getting, or if your organization provides fees based on attendance. So let's say there's a student athletic fee. Well, that number can be predicted to be 100. And then if only 80 people show up, you have to adjust your budget based on getting 80 instead of 100 units. So again, both of those things they coincide with each other. The chapter does a great job of giving you some examples. I'm going to let you read that and kind of go through that on your own. But, when you think about forecasting and budgeting, it's pretty self-explanatory. I mean, there's some really basic components that people just think it's so crazy. But on the surface, it's not. You can definitely get detailed when you start looking at percentage reductions or percentage increases. But again, if that is your world, great. But for some of you, that's not your world. And what you need to be able to do is understand when your CFO walks into your office and says, we need to do this, you need to have a good understanding of what they're talking about. Here's a very simple example. And if we look at sales revenue over a 5-year period, year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, things are improving. We can insert a linear trend, and over that 10 years, we might say, wow, when we get to year 10, we're going to be over 1.35 million. Well, when we do that same trend line for moving averages, basically adjusting for the average of each year, we see that there's a good chance we may not get there. And so it's important that if you're going to insert trend lines and you're going to insert data from calculation of a trend, you've got to make sure that you're using the appropriate numbers and the appropriate calculation. Now, is it inappropriate to use that linear trend line that shoots way up? Well, you think about what's your market, what's your opportunities. For some people, they're maxing out their demographics, they're maxing out their market. And the only way to change that is to target different individuals and expand your market. So if you're going to be creative and do those kinds of things, then yeah, it's definitely worthwhile. But if you're looking at your increases, and those increases are really decreasing every year, the total is increasing, but the amount that it's increasing gets smaller and smaller and smaller. You're approaching a point where you're going to have saturation, and that line's actually going to dip down. It's going to level off. So these are easy examples. What you're going to see if you look at an athletic organization budget is not going to be this simple. But for the purposes of trying to explain this, this kind of stuff's pretty easy. When you start to get into units and departments, for example, sports medicine, what are we spending on supplies? We're spending this much on supplies. Well, we just added a new sport, and now we've spent this increment more. What are we going to predict down the road? How much more are we going to have to spend to maintain this? Maybe it's salaries and staffing. We've increased our student athletes by 100. How much support staff, how much money in salaries are we going to have to invest to keep our support staff enough so that we're not destroying them, but we're able to actually provide services to our kids, but maintain our budget? Those are the kinds of things that are important when you start to look at forecasting and budget. Now, there are some major problems with forecasting. Who in the world predicted this pandemic? The world basically shut down. It's been 6 months now. The decrease in funds from the NCAA basketball tournament are going to be felt for multiple years. It's going to be absolutely crazy to watch this year. If college football doesn't happen, which right now, I've got my fingers crossed like everybody else. If the NFL doesn't happen this year, what's going to happen? Right now, Major League Baseball, they've been fighting over money this entire time. They're actually going to do something. The NBA is trying to do something inside a quote-unquote bubble. But what happens if those sports don't go? We're already seeing that the individuals who are working in those organizations selling T-shirts and selling Cokes and hot dogs and hamburgers, they're getting crushed. They're out of a job. We see that. We also see from, as much as you want to say, the executives, they're taking a beating. We're seeing major college sports where the top earning coaches are taking 10 and 15% pay cuts along with the president and athletic director. So this is real. And so we've forecasted what this is going to be. And now you've got to turn around and you draw a line in the sand and say, okay, here's where we are now. How do we adjust this budget? How can we forecast what things are going to be? And it's a very scary thought, because if you're realistic, the forecast is going to be very, very, very bad. And when you do that, you at least give yourself a little bit of hope. When you create a budget, again, these are very, very simple things. You be objective. When you're objective, you look at things for what they are. How many do we actually need? What is a realistic amount that we can invest in this area? Is this a team? Is this a sport that if we invest more money into recruiting, we're going to get a return? And I'll give you a great example. If you have a sport that is non-revenue generating, meaning you don't pay for it, there's no cost to get into the game. There's very minimal return if they win their conference tournament. And, if they get into the NCAA tournament, they're projected to lose in the first round, and it's just very minimal return. How much are you going to want to invest to keep this sport going if you can take that money and put it into a sport that is revenue generating, that is going to get a return if they are successful? And, and I'm not named a specific sport, but that's kind of where you have to think about this, because a lot of those non-revenue generating sports live off the revenue of those revenue generating sports. And it's hard, because when you look at opportunity and you look at fairness and you look at, everybody needs to be on an equal field. That's great, but that's not the reality. And the person creating the budget, it's very difficult. And I would argue that if you're creating the budget, it's not your role to worry about opportunities. It's your role to place the money where it can be used the most effective. Now, the athletic director, the leader, the general manager, whoever that is, they're the ones that can kind of say, well, we need to really move this over. We need to move this over. We need to make sure, because, again, as the CFO, your job is to, in the year, either with money or breaking even. If you break even, that's fantastic. Always use the past as a predictor of the future. What have we been doing? Have we been successful? It's always kind of a catch-22. What if a team has their budget cut by let's say 15%, and then they win the league. Well, it's easy to make the assumption, well, you didn't need that money anyway. When the reality is that person has 3 years of good recruiting classes at a higher budget, and that's why they won. They didn't, this decrease in budget, that's going to affect them down the road 2 to 3 years. If you cut my budget by, I don't know, $30,000, $40,000 now, as a coach, as a team, that's not going to hurt me immediately right now. That's going to hurt me 2 to 3 years down the road. And so when you're thinking about those kinds of things, you've got to be very forward thinking and predict and really look at what the reality of the budget cut means. When you have those bad things that happen and you have those rainy days, you need to adjust accordingly. If you need to make a 10% reduction across the board, make a 10% reduction off the top. Then you can reallocate the money into the areas that are needed. Because a team may say, you know what, if you're going to take 10% of my budget, I'd rather you take it out of operating because I don't want to take it out of travel and I don't want to take it out of recruiting. Or another team may say, hey, I'm good with you taking all 10% out of recruiting. Just don't take it out of my operating or travel. Most people do not want you to take money out of their travel because it's hard to travel as it is at the mid-major level. And then the last point is just to aim to hit your number. If you're at the end of the year, as I mentioned earlier, if you can break even, that's perfect. That means that you have estimated your revenues and expenditures really well, and there you are. You've hit the thing. Now, if your sales revenue is off the chart and you end up making money at the end of the year, that's great. That's great. And I'm not saying that it's a bad idea, but as an overall budget, if you project that your expenditures are going to be 1.4 million and your revenues are 1.42, that's great because you've put your money out there and used it to the best of its ability. Okay. So make sure that you watch the regression video examples because those are going to help you with assignment 3.2. There is a real stats equation that you can download into Excel, and it's free. And it's one of those where you download into your computer and you hit Control-M to activate it. So you can do that. There's also some regression options within the function tab of Excel, the FX tab. So take a look at those. If you have trouble, let me know. Should be fairly simple. I know the assignments are made to be easy right now because, again, this is pretty clear cut. So hopefully that will go well. Again, I think this is a very important chapter. This finance and prediction is very important because all of you need to understand your balance sheet, but all of you need to understand how to create a budget. So again, if you have questions, let me know. Otherwise, I will talk to you soon.